All right. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. For everybody watching and everybody competing, welcome to the Miss Nationals 2021 debate finals. We have competitors F90KQ and competitor XKCIX competing with us today. And I will now hand the floor over to the judges to take charge.
Assalamu alaikum. First of all, congratulations on making it this far. So let's just get started. Does anyone want to call heads or tails? Anyone?
I guess I'll call heads.
Okay, let me flip the coin. Okay, it's tails. So Yasin, you can choose which side you want to do.
Can we know the debate topic?
Oh, right. The debate topic is social media companies ought to be legally responsible for content posted by users on their platform.
I would like to take the negative side.
All right, that sounds good. And I believe you guys have 5 minutes of prep time before, right? Okay, let me set that up for you. You guys can see my screen, right? Okay, let me set the timer now. Okay, that is time. So we'll start off with the affirmative constructive speech. So Arib, you have 6 minutes to say your constructive. Whenever you're ready, you can begin.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Arib Ghani, and I am for the affirmative on the topic resolved social media companies ought to be legally responsible for content posted by users on their platforms. I'd like to start by defining some key terms. First of all, social media refers to online platforms where users can create and share content or participate in networking, and legally responsible means that social media companies can be sued for illegal content on platforms. To start, I'd like to provide some context for this debate. Imagine a reality where users can spread and post whatever media they wish over social media platforms. That means all types of hate speech, illegal and inappropriate content, and dangerous rhetoric would travel across the world fueling crime and hatred. On the other hand, imagine a reality imposing harsh government censorship. They would function much like Big Brother, but these are the realities that would occur if we negate the resolution. Instead, Judge, I implore you to affirm the resolution and hold social media companies legally responsible for content posted by users on their platforms. With that, I'd like to go into my first contention, which is radical ideas and dangerous content. We've already seen how radical ideas and dangerous content can spread throughout social media and the devastating implications. For example, the recent attacks on the Capitol led to the very President of the United States being banned on Twitter and social media platforms. Social media is one of many factors that played a role in the deadly attack on the US Capitol. The riot was openly planned online for weeks, but big tech has allowed conspiracy theories and calls for political violence to run rampant online for years. Without holding social media companies responsible, this dangerous rhetoric and these dangerous ideas can spread quicker than ever before. We can also look to the election in 2016. According to Brian Cummings, foreign spies took to social media platforms such as Facebook and Twitter to spread misinformation and influence voters. This misinformation negatively affects the democracy, as one of the examples cited was that some sources would actually provide incorrect voting dates to minority groups online. This hurts American democracy and democracy around the world. Another big aspect is terrorist plots. With social media, it's easier than ever before to communicate, and that means for dangerous people as well, which is why Carafano found in 2015 that over a 14-year time period, the number of plots planned over social media skyrocketed. Regulation helps because it holds people accountable. For example, imagine a social media influencer with limited medical knowledge suggesting to use medication, which leads to many young and impressionable followers to take the advice and potentially result in injury. If it were a licensed doctor, that person would be held accountable. That's why on social media, we need to hold social media companies responsible. That way they can self-regulate and ensure that these individuals are held responsible. This is precisely why the National Media Council of the UAE created regulations to ensure that those using social media for commercial purposes must be licensed. In addition, unwanted content spreads rapidly throughout social media. There's lots of content that is inappropriate and should not be allowed for kids. Social media companies must be responsible for this content, for otherwise there is no way of preventing exposure to younger children. Claire Morel, a policy analyst, explains the need to amend Section 230. A lawsuit was recently filed against Twitter for allowing illicit content to be spread on their platforms. Claire Morel explains that the content was a form of abuse, so this not only hurt the victim initially, but the damage was furthered each time it was shared, which is facilitated with the social media platforms. My second contention is protecting freedoms. Government censorship is inevitable. With the prior dangers listed, it is inevitable that some form of regulation is needed. This may come down to the government, as we've already seen with the tobacco and cigarette industry. However, holding social media companies accountable means they will self-regulate, which prevents government censorship. Governments will become more aggressive in their oversight if they are granted the power of censorship. According to the Harvard Business Review, movie and video game companies face a similar threat. However, they were able to impose self-regulations to keep the government at bay, and these regulations are still in use today and have, according to the Harvard Business Review, have been very effective. The dangers of government censorship are clear, with Fleming Rose showing how the Federalist government of John Adams was able to suppress anti-Federalist ideals in the press, which hurts the American democracy. Therefore, it is in the social media company and the public's best interest to avoid government censorship, which is why we should hold social media companies accountable. My third point is economic reasons. First of all, social media companies should self-regulate in their own best interest because this promotes both effective and good business. Although corporations may initially believe that self-regulation is bad for business, Michael Kusumana finds that allowing bad behavior on digital platforms undermines consumer trust, which does not allow these platforms to thrive. In the long term, self-regulation is better than no regulation or government regulation. There are different methods of regulation called ex ante and ex post, and we've already seen ex ante regulation used in YouTube. YouTube, which employs 10,000 people globally for monitoring and removal of objectionable content, took down 8 million videos in 2018 during a 3-month period, 81% of which were removed automatically for inappropriate content. In addition, having cooperations among digital corporations is a positive, especially whenever it comes to self-regulation. Having multiple companies engage in this practice promotes competition and cooperation among these corporations, because if there is a certain social media platform that does not self-regulate and allows this dangerous and inappropriate content to circulate, then users will lose trust and move to other platforms. For these reasons, I believe that social media companies ought to be responsible for content posted by users on their platforms due to, first, the spread of radical and dangerous ideas, secondly, the protection of freedoms, and third, the promotion of business. Jazakallah khair.
Okay, Yassine, do you want any prep time?
I would like 2 minutes, please.
Okay, I'll set that for you, starting now. Okay. This is the 3-minute cross-examination. So the negative will be asking questions to the affirmative, starting now.
Thank you so much for your plan and your amazing speech, but I do have a few questions. You say that some form of regulation is needed and that these companies should self-regulate. And then you say we should hold these companies accountable. Who is your we in this statement?
We are referring to the government, because the government should be holding the social media companies accountable. And if they do so, then we as a public can also note that the social media companies have the responsibility to ensure there's no illegal content.
So are you suggesting that there's a difference between the government holding the companies accountable and the companies self-regulating?
No, I'm actually saying that if we hold the social media companies accountable, then they will self-regulate, because then they won't want to allow illegal content. If they do, they're going to get sued. So that leads to self-regulation.
I understand. You also say that if a licensed doctor gives a prescription medicine to a patient that is not allowed, then we should hold the licensed doctor accountable. In this case, would we hold the pharmacy that makes this medication or spreads this medication held accountable?
If they allow it, because what I'm trying to say is that, like, let's say social media self-regulates, right? Then they can hold that individual who is on social media accountable. Whereas currently that will not happen.
Okay. And then you say that the president was banned from Twitter, which we all know. So when Twitter banned the president, was anyone holding the platform accountable?
No, that was meant to provide an example of why it is important to monitor dangerous rhetoric. What would be happening in the prose world if we affirm the resolution is that this would happen because Twitter did that out of goodwill, right? If they allowed Donald Trump to stay on, they wouldn't have been sued. However, if we hold these companies responsible, then they will be legally responsible in addition to doing things out of goodwill.
Okay. And then you mentioned how hate speech and rhetoric is spread throughout social media. Would you agree that positive information is also spread through social media and it has been a facilitator to bring news and make people aware about things that happen all over the world?
I very much agree. And I believe that is a very important point, that positive information can spread. However, with the resolution, we are talking about, as I defined, social media companies would be held responsible for illegal content. So that does not include the positive content.
I understand. You also say that you talk about self-regulation, government holding accountable. So, and then you say that regulations may cause users to lose trust. Isn't that sort of contradicting?
What I mean is that government censorship will cause users to lose trust. Sorry, so I think there are two different things here. So government censorship, I said, is bad because that would lead to the elimination of freedoms. Whereas what I mentioned about consumers losing trust is what would happen is if there is no regulation at all. So those are two different contrasting scenarios.
That's all I have for now. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Would the negative want any prep time?
Yes, I would like 2 minutes, please.
Okay, you have the 7-minute speech starting now.
Thank you so much. So I'd like to start by saying that the first example the affirmative had given was that the president was banned from Twitter. And then he agreed to the fact that there was no government holding Twitter accountable at the time. So if the social media companies are already doing what the sole purpose of this argument is, then why does the government need to go out of its way to holding them accountable? Then he gives an example of a licensed doctor giving a patient a medicine and them being held accountable. My question was that is the pharmacist or the truck driver that is delivering this medicine to the pharmacy or to the doctor being held accountable? No, the truck driver facilitates the transportation. The pharmacy facilitates transportation, just like social media facilitates the facilitates the transfer of information. Then they say protection of freedom, which I totally agree with. the freedoms need to be protected. But when the government is holding these social media companies accountable for specific posts, then the social media companies will ban those posts. By social media banning those posts because the government is holding them accountable, government is censoring what we want on the social media platform, hence creating a contradiction in its points. 7.9 billion people. Can anyone predict what these 7.9 billion individuals will be doing the next moment? If you cannot predict, then how can we stop? So then how are social media companies to be legally held responsible for content posted by users on their platforms? I'm not saying that misuse and false information will go unheard and unsaid. What I'm saying is social media should be regulated, but not liable. At the recent Senate Commerce Committee hearing, Google CEO Sundar Pichai lauded Section 230 as a foundational to US leadership in the tech sector. Section 230 affords websites too much discretion in how they moderate content, resulting in arbitrary decisions that some users call unlawful censorship. Yes, the law needs to be amended, but not so that companies are held accountable, but rather regulated. The freedom of speech. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or the press. This is our constitutional right. So when we hold social media companies accountable for what people post on an open platform, we suffocate the voice of the people by punishing the platform instead of dealing with the issue at its roots. Will hate crimes stop if social media companies are penalized? No, these hate crimes are very much rampant before social media. Yes, the platform may be misused and the word spread a lot faster, but by hurting the companies, we're affecting the spread of also positive information, of acknowledgement of the disparities of our society. Social media help raises awareness instead of punishing the facilitator and using them as an asset to find criminals. The goal is to establish a free and safe society, correct? To establish that, on one side, we need to stop the crime by catching the criminals and then rectify them, and on the other side, making people aware of the crime and training them to deal with it appropriately under the law and regulation, of course. Covering or hiding the crime will not resolve the issue. Rather, it will allow it to grow unnoticed, and then one day it'll explode. Slavery, racism, all of this grew way before social media happened. So who are the criminals? Not the media platformers, but rather the posters, the people who are instigating it. Looking at current events, Palestine for 80 years, actually many more, the people of Palestine are being tortured. But the situation and issue has just recently received spotlight due to media. Now, along with Muslims, people of all other religions, the common people are standing side by side to fight for the rights of the people from across the sea. By holding companies legally responsible, we are hampering the process of the spread of information, which may result in unprecedented ramifications, as per law professor at St. John's University in New York. If per se these companies are penalized by nations or governments that don't like the information being spread, then no information or data will reach the service. Then no one would have heard the cries of Palestine. Max Schusers, president of the Computer and Communications Industry Association, which counts Google and Facebook both among its members, said that the supposedly simple solution of holding companies legally responsible for content posted by users on their platform would result in tech giants having to obey 50 separate sets of laws governing user content. Instead, he suggests law enforcement energies may be better spent pursuing the millions of tips that tech industry sent over every year, only a small fraction of which he noted resulted in investigations. By using our resources and alerts properly, the atrocities that were once the main reason for accountability in the first place would be void. Thorough investigations will allow the threat to be prevented or even reduce the response time and hysteria. Social media companies are paying their due by notifying the agencies. It's time the government uses that due effectively. The government should make a standard rule, like Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg said. The company ought to be regulated as something in between a telecommunications company and a newspaper. He says regulated, not held accountable, which is very different. And I'm not saying that social media platforms aren't held accountable, but instead they are held accountable for following the laws and regulations as opposed to what the users post. Basically, social media companies ought to be legally responsible for following the law. The Telecommunications Regulations 2000 gives businesses the right to monitor communications on their own networks. On the other hand, if any newspaper is found to have misinformation, defamation, slander, or libel, they can be sued or shut down as a company. A middle ground would be something similar to what Matt had suggested. The social media companies regulate their own posts as they deem fit. If any user or users causes suspicion, these are reported to the government and investigated by the government. I'd like a moment to define the affirmative statement. When social media companies are to be legally responsible for content posted by users on their platforms, we're only hurting the companies. Do you think this would discourage the users that are driven by hate to stop exploiting situations? 1997 is when social media was launched into this world. Hate spread like wildfire before that too. Social media facilitates freedom of speech. Schools facilitate education and freedom of speech, freedom of independent thinking. So if there's a criminal that comes out of a school where majority of the students are good, law-abiding citizens, would we say the school ought to be legally responsible for unlawful students after school? If someone puts graffiti on a wall, will we hold the wall accountable for vandalism? If a politician says something wrong on a mic, which is heard by millions of people due to the loudspeaker, so is the loudspeaker held responsible for misinformation? The biggest misconception is that the platform is a voice or the actor. Incorrect. The social media is the mic and the wall. So why should social media companies be legally responsible for content posted by users on their platforms? Thank you.
Okay, would the affirmative want any prep time before cross-examination?
Sure, I will take my 3 minutes.
3 minutes, okay. Okay, let me set the timer for 3 minutes, and you may begin.
So my first question is, do you believe that dangerous ideas and rhetoric should be allowed to propagate and spread throughout social media?
I do not.
Okay. My second question is that do you recognize that within the Constitution, there are limitations to freedom of speech and freedom of press?
Yes, there are.
Okay. And also you mentioned in your constructive speech that you were saying something about Palestine, correct? So why would social media companies be held legally responsible for communicating and news about Palestine if it's not illegal?
That's what I'm trying to say. When governments are allowed to hold these companies legally responsible for specific information, now my country may think that specific piece of information is a positive idea, but if another country thinks that's not positive idea, can influence the way that people think in a different way, they could hold those companies legally responsible for what might be presumed as a positive or negative thing. Either way, hurting information spreading in general. I hope that clarifies it.
Okay, and my next question is, how would companies reliably regulate if they're not legally responsible? What is their motivation to do so?
So I had given the example that Matt Schurz, the president of the Computer and Communications Industry Association, which has Google and Facebook underneath, and what the Facebook CEO had suggested, which that it would be regulated in between a telecommunications company and newspapers company, and that is incentive enough. Because there are laws, we're just not holding them accountable for what other people post on their platform.
So I'm afraid I don't understand. What is the incentive? You said it's between telecommunications and newspaper, but I don't understand. What's the incentive there?
So the social media companies regulate their own posts. We're giving them the freedom to regulate their own posts. And if they find anything that is incorrect, then they come back to the government and that is investigated. So the incentive is that they're allowed to regulate their own posts.
I don't think that would make sense. How would a freedom to do so be an incentive to do so? I think the incentive, I'm afraid I'm not completely sure. Currently, what do you believe is the incentive for social media companies to regulate?
There isn't an incentive right now. That's why we're amending the law so that we are not holding them accountable, because that is an option. So instead of that, we're giving the freedom to self-regulate, as you suggested, and also self-holding them accountable so that they give us these investigative processes.
So in your scenario where they're self-regulating, what happens to them if they don't?
If they're not doing...
Yeah, in the scenario you mentioned that they'd self-regulate without being held legally responsible, what would happen if they don't self-regulate?
But that's the law. The law is that
I understand. But then aren't they legally responsible for self-regulating? Isn't that
what I had suggested is that they are held accountable, but not for what users post, instead for following the law. And the law suggests that they have to self-regulate.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so would the F want some prep time for the rebuttal?
Yes, I'll take all my prep time.
Okay, you have 2 minutes left.
Was it? Okay.
Yeah. Okay, this is the 4-minute after rebuttal. Whenever you're ready, you can begin.
Okay, so I'd like to start by establishing a connection between the affirmative stance on this topic and self-regulation. If social media companies are legally responsible for content posted by users on their platforms, then there's an incentive for them to self-regulate and ensures that they do so. Now, in the crossfire, my opponent mentioned that there will be in their world that there will be repercussions if the social media company does not regulate. This means that if a user posts something illegal and the social media company is unable to self-regulate, then the social media company can be sued. Even if the lawsuit is on their inability for regulating, they are being held legally responsible for the content posted on their site because their inability to regulate it is what led to the lawsuit. This falls directly under the definition of the prompt and supports my affirmative stance on the position. Despite this concession, I will proceed to refute some of the points mentioned by the negative. They first mentioned that social media companies are already doing self-regulation. However, they're not doing it enough. I've already mentioned the example of the Capitol attacks, and that was openly communicated over social media. Clearly, there is not enough incentive for them to be regulating. Goodwill is not enough. They also said that how would it be possible if people are constantly posting on social media? As I mentioned, there are two types of like censorship or regulation. They're called ex ante and ex post. Ex post means that the regulation would occur after the media is posted. So of course there could be a time buffer, because I agree, it would be impossible for social media companies to check every single thing before it is posted. And that is what ex ante regulation falls under. I also provided the example of YouTube for that. They said that hate speech will continue even if social media is regulated. However, they're arguing that we shouldn't stop it spreading on social media just because it exists outside of social media. As I mentioned, social media allows hate speech to spread far more rapidly than ever before. We look at the attacks in the Capitol again. Those are openly communicated over social media. Those sentiments could not have reached such a broad population in such a short amount of time without the usage of social media. And therefore, it is important that we regulate so that social media is self-regulated. And even if hate speech continues outside of that, its effectiveness goes down. They also said that it will affect the spread of positive information. However, as I mentioned, they will be held legally responsible for content that is illegal. And therefore, this also does not limit freedom of speech, because this means users can still post content, for example, critical of the government. That is not illegal. What is illegal is if we look at the restrictions to freedom of speech, any sort of rhetoric that incites violence or is part of hate speech, those are things that are illegal, and that's what they'd be held responsible for. They also said that by supporting the affirmative, we are only hurting the company. However, they failed to address my point, my third point, which was the promotion of business if we do so. I mentioned that if these companies are not regulated, then what will happen is that users will lose trust and they'll switch to other platforms. And I also gave historical examples. If we don't want to talk hypothetically, I gave historical examples of the movie and video game industry, where there was too much unwanted and illegal content, so the government censored or they offered to intervene and do censorship. However, they were held legally responsible. Again, they were held legally responsible for these movies and video games, and this regulation has continued and has been very effective according to the Harvard Business Review. And again, this falls under what the negative was saying, which is that they're not being held responsible for explicitly what is happening in that movie or in that video game. Rather, they're being held responsible for, or they're being sued for their inability to do so, meaning that they're responsible for that content. And therefore, that still falls under the definition of the affirmative. And therefore, Judge, I implore you to affirm the resolution. Jazakallah khair.
Okay, so Yassine, I think you have a minute left for prep time. Do you want to use that?
Sure. Thank you.
Let's write that now. Yasin, whenever you're ready, you can begin.
Can I just be retold how much time I have?
So there's 5 minutes of prep time for each of you. So you used up 3 minutes before, or sorry, you used 2 minutes before COSEX, and then 2 minutes before your rebuttal, or your first speech, and then now you used up a minute. So yeah.
Thanks so much.
Mhm.
I'd like by starting by refuting the point that my solution somehow falls under the affirmative's definition of this case. But I'd like to clarify the fact that I said that it would be regulated in between a telecommunications company and a news company. So I'll define that again. The Telecommunications Regulation 2000 gives telecommunication businesses the right to monitor communications on their own networks, self-regulating. And on the other hand, newspapers are found to have misinformation, defamation, slander, or libel. They can be sued or shut down as a company by the public or by the government. Hence, something in the middle would keep both self-regulating and being held accountable. They're not being held accountable for spreading misinformation or facilitating posts that are incorrect. Instead, they're being held accountable for not reporting to the government of any suspicious use. That's like saying if we are to, because social medias are defined as facilitators of information, not creators of information, that's like saying, like I had said before, the loudspeaker or a telephone being held accountable for what information is passed through them. Hence, social media companies cannot be held responsible for something that they're not doing. Then he also said promotion of businesses and how it's not only affecting the companies. I agreed to that. I said by holding them accountable, we are negatively affecting these companies. Users will leave. But what he's not understanding is the connection between self-regulating, holding accountable, and then lastly, government censorship. If a government holds a specific company accountable for specific post, that company will not allow posts as such. This is government censoring information, legal or illegal, and we're putting it up to the government's understanding on what is correct or incorrect, moral or immoral, legal or illegal. And it is important to understand that this is, by definition, government censorship. Then they say that my solution somehow indirectly holds the companies accountable for each individual's post. Like I said before, it is not about the individual post. It's about suspicious activity as a whole and is in between the telecommunications and newspaper. One is one extreme, the other is another extreme, as suggested by the Facebook CEO, Mark Zuckerberg. They also, and then, so now the points that they hadn't rebutted on my side. They hadn't said anything about my example about the graffiti and the loudspeaker. These are integral points and comparisons into what social media is actually defined as, and hence holding them accountable clearly doesn't make sense. They also said, they also hadn't mentioned about what the computer and communications industry's president said about holding these legally accountable would mean 50 separate sets of laws. If the president of this organization believes that this would be inconvenient for the companies in the sense that posts would be delayed and causing disruptions in the post, if the person who knows it all is saying that this will cause disturbances in both positive and negative information, then it has clearly been stated what holding each and every single company for each and every single post is going to result in. Many philosophers and scientists, as such, the one from St. John's University in New York, said that this will cause unprecedented ramifications. A law professor had said this. Unprecedented ramifications can hurt the First Amendment and our right to speech and press. Going back to Palestine, what I said before, countries have their own perspectives on what is legal and illegal, which information can be beneficial or unbeneficial. And when we put this power in the government's hand, we are giving up our liberty to the government. We're giving this up, yeah. And the goal, again, my goal is to establish a free and safe society. By creating a free and safe, by enacting my plan, we are creating that free and safe society where all of our liberties are respected and social media companies are held accountable for not following the law by not reporting back to the government instead of each individual's post on their site. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. I repeat again, our freedom of speech is being hurt here because social media companies are being censored for what people are saying on their posts. Our constitutional law cannot be taken away. There's no justification. And if the affirmative says that we're not censoring it, in the long term, yes, we are censoring it. By penalizing companies for specific posts, we are censoring those specific posts. And when we start by censoring those specific posts, this gives a lot of leeway for the government to censor all other posts that they don't like or they don't deem fit, hurting our civil liberties at the end of the day. Section 230 does need to be amended, but it's about how we amend it. The amendment doesn't mean that we hold them accountable for each individual post, like I keep saying. They should be held accountable and regulated, self-regulated, and held accountable for not self-regulating. It is, after all, foundational to US leadership in the tech sector. It is not only about the social media companies anymore, it's about the individual person and about the government and the culture of the United States. Public will sue companies regardless of whether we hold them accountable or not. But if the government punishes for not regulating, then we are censoring. And that's incentive. At the end, I would like to say again, when a student that's not a good law-abiding citizen of the United States comes out of school not learning anything, then we don't go back and hold the school accountable for what the student turned out to be. Same way, the social media being a facilitator of information, making it so fast, spreading it across the globe, cannot be held accountable for each individual post on their thing. Thank you.
Okay, Arib, you used up all 5 minutes of your prep time, so do you just want to get into your speech?
Sure, I guess so.
Okay, so this is the 3-minute closing speech for affirmative. Whenever you're ready.
Okay, so first I'd like to address, there were 2 examples brought up, which I did not address, being the graffiti and loudspeaker. I'd like to mention that there's a huge difference between an inanimate object and a global corporation, because these corporations hire, first of all, they have algorithms to track for these types of illegal content, and they hire thousands of people to monitor. I gave the example of YouTube, which was able to remove 81% of the content that was unwanted automatically. And the remainder was done using all the people. They also mentioned that there would be 50 different sets of laws, and this would be inconvenient. As I mentioned, with regards to the impracticality of it, there exists ex-ante laws, and we have seen how practical it can be with YouTube. They said that the owner, this powerful person, said that they do not believe it is helpful. But I already mentioned why companies may initially not believe it is helpful because it's more work for them. But then I mentioned why it is, and I cited the movie and video game industry. This has not been addressed throughout this debate. They also said repeatedly that it hurts our right to freedom of speech and freedom of press. I'd like to reiterate that they're only held legally responsible for content that is illegal. This means the government can't sue social media companies if someone posts something against the government. That lawsuit will not go through because that content is not illegal. And regarding freedom of speech, as I mentioned before, not all speech is protected by freedom of speech, most importantly, hate speech, which is one thing that we've mentioned throughout this debate. Then we come to this point about social medias should self-regulate, seems to be agreed on both sides. But the question comes to, should they be legally responsible for not self-regulating or for content posted by users on their platforms? And as I mentioned again, the fact that they are being sued for not regulating means that they are responsible for the content posted by users on their platforms. It doesn't mean the individual person, it means that content posted by users. They were not able to effectively address it, and therefore they're being sued. And this is what the Khan has also advocated for. Now, I'd like to go back to my contentions. My first contention, which is that radical ideas and dangerous ideas can spread. I gave the example of the Capitol and also other terrorist attacks, which plots have been skyrocketing through this connection over social media. My second point was that it protects freedoms, because unlike what the Khan is saying, with self-regulation, this means that these freedoms will be protected. If we left it up to government self-regulation, to government censorship, then they could hold social media accountable or hold individuals accountable for things that are not illegal. And my third point was that it promotes business. Contrary to what the Khan has been mentioning, this can promote business by ensuring trust in users. And we've also seen this historically with the movie and video game industry, as I mentioned before. And for these reasons, I implore you, Judge, to affirm the resolution that social media companies ought to be legally responsible for content posted by users on their platforms. Jazakallah.
Okay, that was a great debate. Let me unshare my screen. 1 second. Okay. Well, good job to both of you. I think, yeah, we will have to make a decision from now, but yeah. Do you guys have any questions about anything? Okay, well, good job. You guys did great.
Jazakallah khair, everybody, for participating in this debate. Thank you very much to the competitors. You guys put on an awesome debate. It was very exciting to watch. Jazakallah khair to our judges for taking time out of their Sunday to help us judge. Competitors, you guys are free to go. We will see you at the award ceremony in approximately an hour. And judges, if you don't mind going to the Discord judges room so you guys can deliberate more there. All right, Jazakallah khair, everybody. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Jazakallah khair.
Jazakallah.